The scorching summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Silverstone, Arizona territory. July 1878 had brought a brutal heat wave that left the surrounding desert landscape parched and cracked, painted in harsh shades of amber and rust. But inside the town hall, the air felt thick with something far heavier than heat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Montgomery Cole stood at the edge of a growing crowd, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his expensive Stetson hat. At 45, he carried the confidence of a self-made man in his straight posture and keen eyes that missed nothing. The platinum watch chain across his vest caught the harsh sunlight as he surveyed the scene. Despite owning the largest cattle operation in the territory, Cole rarely visited Silverstone except for essential business matters. The auction block had been erected in the center of the hall, a simple wooden platform that seemed to diminish the humanity of anyone forced to stand upon it. Cole had come to town for banking business, nothing more. His vast ranch, the Starlight Valley spread, produced more beef and profit than any 3 competing operations combined. He managed thousands of head of cattle, employed dozens of cowboys, and had built an empire from nothing but grit and determination. He should have concluded his business at the First Territorial Bank and ridden his prized stallion back to his sprawling ranch house, where his staff would have prepared his evening meal and seen to his every comfort. But something made him stay. Some unnamed pull that drew him to this unusual gathering on this sweltering Thursday afternoon. The auctioneer, a thin man named Ezekiel Thorne, with a voice that sliced through conversation like a knife, climbed onto the platform with practiced efficiency. His black suit remained mysteriously unwrinkled despite the oppressive heat, and his calculating eyes scanned the crowd with professional assessment. "Ladies and gentlemen of Silverstone and surrounds," Thorne announced, his voice echoing off the wooden walls of the hall. "Today we have a most unusual offering to present for your consideration. A complete orphaned family unit, as it were, available for immediate service to any upstanding citizen with the means to provide proper supervision." Cole felt his jaw tighten even before he fully understood what was happening. Around him, the crowd pressed closer with the hungry anticipation of vultures circling dying prey. Women in their practical frontier dresses whispered behind paper fans, while men in dusty boots and sweat-stained shirts shuffled forward for a better view. Then they appeared. 7 children emerged from a side room, herded forward by a deputy with a rifle slung casually across his back. A girl who couldn't have been more than 15 walked at the front, her spine straight despite the obvious exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She wore a simple calico dress that had been mended multiple times, but she carried herself with a dignity that no amount of hardship could diminish. Behind her came 6 more children, arranged by height like a descending staircase. The oldest boy, perhaps 13, kept his arm protectively around a girl of about 11. Behind them, 2 boys who appeared to be around 9 and 8 respectively, followed by twin girls who looked to be 6, holding hands tightly. At the end, a tiny boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old clutched the dress of one of the twins, his thumb planted firmly in his mouth as he stared wide-eyed at the gathered crowd. Cole felt something shift inside his chest. In the oldest girl's protective stance over her siblings, he saw an echo of his own mother during their desperate years on the frontier. In the oldest boy's fierce protectiveness, he remembered himself, at that age, trying to shield his younger sisters from harsh realities after their father's death in a mining accident. And in the terrified faces of the smallest children, he saw innocence being bartered away like livestock. "Lot number 23, Thorne announced with businesslike efficiency. The Jenkins orphans recently come under county supervision following most unfortunate circumstances. The eldest girl, Elizabeth, is 15 and well-trained in household duties. The others range in age from 4 to 13, all in satisfactory health and capable of labor appropriate to their years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some voices carried excitement, others disgust, but most held the detached calculation of people evaluating potential servants rather than children in desperate need. Cole wanted to look away from the casual cruelty of it all, but he found himself frozen in place, watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort. Thorne continued his clinical presentation. Due to the tragic demise of both parents in the recent fever outbreak, and with no known relatives willing to claim them, the county has determined that the most practical course of action is to secure proper employment and housing for these orphans. Bidding will begin at $10 for the entire group, as we prefer to keep the siblings together if possible, though individual offers will be considered if necessary. Cole learned fragments of their story from the whispered conversations around him. Their parents, Joseph and Mary Jenkins, had been respected homesteaders who died within days of each other during the typhoid outbreak that had swept through the poorer sections of the county 2 months earlier. With no family nearby and mounting debts from their parents' medical treatment, the children had been taken in by the county orphanage, an overcrowded, underfunded institution that couldn't support them indefinitely. The system was perfectly legal under territorial law. Orphaned children could be bound out as indentured servants to those who would house and feed them, with the county handling the arrangements and collecting a small administrative fee. It was, officials claimed, a humanitarian act that prevented siblings from being separated and sent to different institutions across the territory. In practice, it was barely distinguishable from slavery with a more palatable name. "Do I hear $10? Thorne called out, his gavel raised in anticipation. A rancher from the northern part of the county raised his hand. Cole recognized him as Walter Briggs, a man known for working his hired hands mercilessly and paying them barely enough to survive. Briggs's small eyes gleamed as he looked over the Jenkins children like he was evaluating livestock at market. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. $10, Briggs called out. The older ones look strong enough for ranch work. Elizabeth. Jenkins's face remained carefully composed, but Cole saw her hand tighten protectively on her youngest brother's shoulder. The little boy had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down his dusty cheeks as he pressed closer to his sister's side. $15, came another voice. This one belonged to Abigail Preston, who owned the largest mining operation outside of town. Preston had a reputation for employing children in her mines, placing them in dangerous tunnels too narrow for adults to navigate. The smaller ones can work the thin seams, and the older girl can cook for my men. Cole found his hands clenching into fists. Around him, the bidding continued with the casual brutality of men haggling over the price of cattle. Elizabeth Jenkins stood on that platform with her siblings pressed close to her sides, watching their fate being decided by strangers who saw them as nothing more than potential labor. $20, Briggs countered, his voice carrying an edge of possessiveness that made Cole's skin crawl. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greedy satisfaction. $20 from Mr. Briggs. Do I hear $25? That's when Cole noticed her eyes. Elizabeth Jenkins was looking directly at him, and in her gaze he saw something that hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't pleading or desperation, though surely she felt both. It wasn't fear, though that was there too in the slight tremor of her hands. What he saw was recognition, the look of one survivor recognizing another across a crowded room. She had seen something in his face, some flicker of genuine human sympathy in a crowd full of calculating stares and cruel amusement. Her look didn't beg for salvation. It simply acknowledged that he was perhaps the only person in that hall who saw her and her siblings as human beings rather than commodities. $25, Preston called out. her voice cutting through Cole's moment of connection with the girl on the platform. The bidding war intensified. Briggs countered with $30. Preston responded with $35. A third voice joined the fray. Marcus Holloway, who owned the largest brothel in the territory and was known to be looking for fresh talent to train. The implication of his interest in a 15-year-old girl made Cole's blood run cold. $40, Holloway announced. The older girl would be quite valuable in my establishment. Cole felt sick. He thought of his own difficult childhood, the years spent protecting his sisters from predatory men like Holloway after their parents died. He remembered the desperate choices his mother had been forced to make to keep food on their table, the backbreaking work that had aged her decades in just a few years. He recalled his vow made at her graveside when he was just 17, that he would build something that mattered, something that would honor her sacrifices. $45, Briggs shouted. His face flushed with the excitement of competition. Cole looked at Elizabeth Jenkins again. She was no longer watching him. Her attention had turned to her siblings, whispering what he assumed were words of comfort to the youngest ones. The oldest boy, who had maintained his protective stance throughout the ordeal, was fighting back tears with the fierce determination of someone forced to grow up too quickly. The scene crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. Cole could walk away. He could finish his business in town, return to his luxurious ranch house, and continue building his cattle empire in solitude. He had enough wealth to live in exceptional comfort for the rest of his days, and no one would blame a successful businessman for focusing on his own affairs. Or he could step forward and change everything. $100, Cole called out, his voice carrying clearly across the hall despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. A hush fell over the crowd. $100 was more than many families in Silverstone saw in 6 months. It was certainly more than anyone expected for orphans who were considered a burden rather than a valuable commodity. Thorne's eyes widened with surprise and delight. $100 from Mr. Cole. Do I hear $110? Briggs scowled and opened his mouth to respond, but Cole cut him off before he could speak. $500, Cole announced, his voice steady despite the way his hands shook, and that's my final offer. The crowd erupted in murmurs of shock and speculation. $500 represented a small fortune in the Arizona Territory of 1878. It was an absurd amount to pay for indentured servants, especially when those servants were children who would consume resources while providing limited labor. It was reckless, impractical, and financially indefensible. It was also the most right thing Jackson Montgomery Cole had done in years. Thorne looked around the crowd expectantly, but the other bidders had fallen silent. $500 was far beyond what anyone was willing to spend on orphan children, especially when those children came with the complication of housing and feeding 7 growing individuals. $500 going once, the auctioneer called out. Going twice. He paused dramatically, scanning the crowd for any last-minute bids. Sold to Jackson Montgomery Cole for $500. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Cole felt as though he was moving through a dream as he made his way to the front of the crowd. The county clerk, a bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers named Horace Wells, had already prepared the necessary paperwork. The contract was straightforward but binding. Cole would assume full legal responsibility for the Jenkins orphans until each reached the age of 18. In exchange, they would provide labor appropriate to their abilities, and he would provide adequate housing, food, education, and moral supervision. As Cole counted out the bills that represented a mere fraction of his considerable wealth, he caught sight of Elizabeth Jenkins's face. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Suspicion, certainly, and perhaps a cautious hope, but also something that might have been wariness. After all, she had no way of knowing whether she and her siblings were being rescued or simply transferred to a different form of captivity. "Mr. Cole," Clerk Wells said as he handed over the signed contract, "you understand that you are now legally responsible for the conduct and welfare of all 7 children. Any attempt to abandon this responsibility before each child reaches majority will result in significant legal penalties." Cole nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to the practical implications of what he had just done. His sprawling ranch house had plenty of room, certainly, but it had been designed for a successful bachelor, not a family of 8. His staff consisted of a cook, a housekeeper, and various ranch hands who knew nothing about caring for children. But those were problems to be solved later. Right now he needed to get the Jenkins children away from the cruel stares and whispered speculation of the crowd. "Miss Jenkins," he said quietly, addressing Elizabeth directly for the first time, "if you and your siblings would follow me, I have a carriage waiting outside." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to discern his intentions from his expression. Finally, she nodded and gathered her siblings around her. "Children," she said softly, "we're going with Mr. Cole now." The oldest boy, Jacob, Thomas learned later, stepped forward slightly. Despite his youth, there was something protective and almost aggressive in his posture. "What do you want with us, mister?" he asked, his voice carrying a challenge that spoke well of his character. Cole knelt down so he could meet the boy's eyes on his level. "I want to give you and your brothers and sisters a place to live where you'll be treated with dignity," he said simply. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I hope that in time you'll see that I mean what I say." Jacob stared at him for another moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "But if you hurt my sisters or brothers, I'll make you sorry." Despite everything, Cole felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "I would expect nothing less," he replied. "A boy who doesn't protect his family isn't much of a man at all." As they made their way through the crowd toward Cole's waiting carriage, he heard the whispered comments and speculation that followed in their wake. Some voices carried disapproval. What was a wealthy bachelor doing with 7 orphan children? Others expressed curiosity about his motives. A few carried darker suggestions about what a man might want with a 15-year-old girl and her siblings. Cole ignored them all. He had spent 15 years listening to business associates and social acquaintances tell him how he should invest, how he should live, how he should solidify his position in territorial society. Today, for the first time and longer than he could remember, he was acting purely on his own moral compass, rather than trying to build his empire or enhance his reputation. The carriage was exactly where he had left it, an expensive conveyance, pulled by 4 matched black horses that represented just one small example of Cole's considerable wealth. The driver, an older man named Simmons who had been with Cole for nearly a decade, raised an eyebrow at the sight of 7 children following his employer, but made no comment. Elizabeth Jenkins helped her smaller siblings into the carriage, while Jacob and the 11-year-old girl, whose name Cole learned was Sarah, climbed up on their own. Cole noticed that Elizabeth moved with careful economy, as if every gesture had been planned to conserve energy. It was the movement of someone who had been hungry for too long, who had learned to function on too little sleep and too much worry. "Miss Jenkins," Cole said, as he prepared to help her into the carriage, "I want you to know that you and your siblings are not my servants. You're my guests until we can figure out a more permanent arrangement that works for everyone." She paused with one foot on the carriage step, looking at him with surprise. "Mr. Cole, the contract. The contract is a legal necessity," Cole interrupted gently. "It doesn't define how we treat each other as human beings." For the first time since he had seen her on the auction platform, Elizabeth Jenkins's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly, her eyes filling with tears that she quickly blinked away. But not before Cole saw the profound relief and cautious gratitude in them. "Thank you," she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. As Cole's carriage rolled out of Silverstone and onto the dirt road that led to his ranch, he felt the weight of 7 new lives settling onto his shoulders. He had no clear plan for how to care for and raise 7 children ranging in age from 4 to 15. He had no experience with children at all, no understanding of what the Jenkins siblings might need to heal from their recent trauma. What he had was a bone-deep certainty that he had done the right thing and a determination to figure out everything else as he went along. The summer sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. In the carriage, he could hear the soft murmur of Elizabeth's voice as she comforted her siblings, and the occasional question from one of the older ones about where they were going. The road ahead stretched through rugged countryside, dotted with saguaro cacti and mesquite trees baking in the lingering heat. Cole had traveled this route countless times over the years, but today it felt different, like a path toward something entirely new rather than simply the way home to an empty house and a solitary life. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of scattered homesteads, where families were beginning their evening routines. Soon Cole would be part of that domestic rhythm again, though in a way he had never imagined when he woke that morning. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. As the carriage wheels rolled steadily over the packed earth road, Cole found himself thinking about his mother and what she would have made of his impulsive decision. She had always been the one to take in strays, to share their meager food with neighbors during hard times, to offer shelter to those with even less than they had. He thought she would have understood. More than that, he thought she would have been proud. The Starlight Valley ranch appeared through the golden afternoon light like a mirage shimmering into reality. Cole felt his chest tighten as they crested the small hill that overlooked his property, not from pride, but from sudden awareness of how intimidating his imposing home might seem to children accustomed to loss and uncertainty. The main house sat in a protected valley surrounded by gently rolling grasslands, a magnificent 2-story structure built from local stone and imported timber. The wide windows gleamed in the late afternoon sun, and the expansive wraparound porch offered shade and comfort even in the harshest weather. Behind the house, multiple outbuildings served various functions: bunkhouses for the ranch hands, stables for the horses, barns for equipment, and winter feed storage. In the distance, vast herds of cattle grazed on the nutritious grasses that had made Cole one of the wealthiest men in the territory. "Children," Elizabeth Jenkins called softly from her seat beside Cole, "come look at where we'll be staying." Cole heard rustling as the 6 younger Jenkins siblings shifted to peer out the carriage windows. The youngest 4-year-old, Benjamin, pointed with wonder at the massive house. "Lizzie, is that a castle?" he asked, his eyes wide with amazement. "No, silly," corrected 11-year-old Sarah with the patient superiority of an older sister. "It's a ranch house. Rich people live in houses like that." Jacob, the 13-year-old who had appointed himself family protector, studied the property with the calculating eye of someone forced to think practically about survival. Cole could almost see him cataloging resources, the size of the operation, the condition of the buildings, the evidence of wealth that might translate into security for his siblings. The 9- and 8-year-old boys, David and Michael, pressed their faces against opposite windows, arguing about which of them could spot more cattle in the distant fields. The 6-year-old twins, Hannah and Rebecca, had fallen asleep against each other during the journey, their identical faces peaceful in a way that spoke of exhaustion beyond their years. As the carriage rolled into the courtyard, Simmons expertly guided the team to a halt before the imposing front steps. Cole's foreman, a weathered man named Harrison, emerged from one of the outbuildings with a confused expression that quickly transformed into shock when he saw the carriage disgorging child after child. Cole set the brake and climbed down, then turned to help Elizabeth from her seat. She accepted his assistance with quiet dignity, but he noticed how she immediately moved to assist her own siblings rather than waiting for him to help them. "Mr. Cole," Elizabeth said as her feet touched solid ground, "this is a magnificent place. We're grateful for your kindness in bringing us here. Cole felt heat rise in his cheeks. Please just call me Jackson, and there's no need for gratitude. This arrangement benefits me as much as it does your family. It was a polite fiction, and they both knew it. Cole had managed perfectly well on his own for years, and taking on 7 children would complicate his life considerably. But something in Elizabeth's expression suggested she appreciated the gesture. That allowed her to accept help without feeling like a burden. Jacob had helped the twins down from the carriage and was now standing protectively close to his sister, his young face serious with responsibility. Sarah held Benjamin's hand while scanning the ranch with curious eyes. Despite their recent trauma, Cole was struck by how well-behaved and considerate the children seemed, a testament to their parents' character and Elizabeth's influence during their absence. I imagine you're all tired and hungry, Cole said, addressing the group but looking primarily at Elizabeth. Why don't we get you settled inside, and then I'll show you around properly tomorrow. The front door opened into a grand entryway, furnished with pieces Cole had collected during his years of success. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall of the adjacent great room, flanked by built-in bookshelves that held Cole's extensive collection of books on ranching, business, and Western history. Large windows faced both east and west to capture the sunrise and sunset, their glass panes spotlessly clean thanks to Cole's efficient housekeeper. Elizabeth stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene with the careful attention of someone evaluating both opportunities and potential threats. The children clustered around her, equally curious and cautious about this new environment that would apparently be their home for the foreseeable future. The kitchen is through here, Cole said, leading them through an archway into the heart of the house. The kitchen was large and well-appointed, with a massive cast-iron stove that Cole had imported from Chicago at considerable expense. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by chairs crafted by the finest furniture maker in Santa Fe. Windows on 2 walls provided good light for cooking and filled the space with the golden glow of late afternoon sun. A hand pump at the sink drew water from the deep well Cole had dug when he first built the ranch, and shelves along the walls held dishes, cookware, and preserved foods. Benjamin immediately gravitated toward a carved wooden horse that sat on a shelf, a souvenir Cole had brought back from a business trip to San Francisco. Though it had been purchased as a decorative item rather than a toy, Cole could see the longing in the little boy's eyes. "May I?" Benjamin asked, looking up at Cole with the solemn politeness of a child who had learned not to assume anything belonged to him. Cole felt his throat constrict slightly. "Of course," he said, taking the horse down and handing it to the boy. "I think that horse has been waiting for someone to play with it." Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath suggested she understood the significance of the gesture, though she said nothing. Instead, she moved to the stove and examined it with the professional interest of someone who would be responsible for preparing meals. "This is a beautiful stove," she said. "Much nicer than anything we had at home." Cole nodded, remembering the day it had been delivered after a difficult journey from the railroad station in Tucson. "It's supposed to be the best available," he said. "My cook, Mrs. Winters, insisted on it. She said life is too short to fight with inferior equipment." At the mention of his cook, Cole realized he needed to prepare his small staff for the dramatic change in household composition. "Speaking of Mrs. Winters," he said, "let me introduce you to the people who help run the ranch. Then we can figure out sleeping arrangements." Over the next hour, Cole introduced the Jenkins children to his startled but adaptable staff. Mrs. Winters, the cook, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had worked for Cole for 8 years. After her initial shock, she quickly began planning how to adjust her menus to appeal to children of various ages. Mrs. Garcia, the housekeeper, immediately began calculating which rooms would need to be prepared and what additional linens would be required. Harrison, the foreman, maintained a stoic expression, though Cole caught him sneaking kind glances at the younger children when he thought no one was looking. The upstairs of the main house consisted of 6 bedrooms and Cole's private study. His own room occupied the largest space, with windows facing both east and south. The others had been designed for guests who rarely visited, making them perfectly suited for their new purpose. "Miss Jenkins, you and Sarah and the twins can take these connecting rooms," Cole said, indicating 2 adjoining bedrooms. "I've been using them mainly for storage, but they have good beds and plenty of space." Elizabeth stepped into the rooms and examined them carefully. Each contained 2 beds with carved wooden headboards, dressers with oval mirrors, and small sitting areas near the windows. The furnishings were simple but high quality, clearly chosen for comfort rather than ostentation. "And the boys?" she asked. "The 3 rooms across the hall should work well for them," Cole replied. "Jacob can have his own room, and David and Michael can share, with Benjamin having the smallest room to himself." Jacob had followed them upstairs, and now stood examining the proposed sleeping arrangements with the same practical assessment he had applied to the ranch itself. "This could work," he said after a moment, surprising Cole with his acceptance. Elizabeth seemed to understand the complex social dynamics at play. "That sounds like an excellent arrangement," she said. "The boys need their own space, and Sarah can help me with the twins." Over the next hour, Cole found himself caught up in the practical business of transforming his bachelor household into a home for 8 people. Mrs. Garcia proved invaluable, producing linens, towels, and basic necessities from storage rooms Cole barely knew existed. Mrs. Winters busied herself preparing a hearty supper that would appeal to children of various ages, while still meeting Cole's usual standards. The children, meanwhile, began the tentative process of exploring their new environment. Jacob appointed himself responsible for settling the younger boys, while Sarah took charge of Benjamin, showing him around the house and explaining what they observed in the patient tone of someone accustomed to caring for younger siblings. By the time the sun began to set behind the western mountains, the Starlight Valley ranch house had been transformed into something it had never been before, a genuinely busy family home. The sounds of children's voices echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long, and the kitchen filled with the purposeful activity of meal preparation. Elizabeth had taken charge of setting the table without being asked, directing her siblings to help with simple tasks that kept them occupied and gave them a sense of contribution. She worked with efficient grace, clearly comfortable with household responsibilities despite the unfamiliarity of the setting. "Can I help?" Cole asked, feeling oddly displaced in his own home. Elizabeth glanced up from the silverware she was arranging. "Could you check if Mrs. Winters needs anything? I'm not sure how she usually serves meals here." It was such a normal domestic request that Cole felt momentarily disoriented. For years he had eaten his meals with minimal fuss, often reading business correspondence while he ate. The idea of a proper family dinner seemed almost fantastically elaborate, yet he found himself eager to establish this new routine. As they gathered around the kitchen table, Cole looked at the faces illuminated by lamplight and felt something shift inside his chest. Benjamin sat on a cushion that brought him closer to table height, carefully cutting his meat into manageable pieces with the focus of a much older child. The twins flanked their older sister, their identical faces showing the relaxation that comes with food and security. David and Michael kept elbowing each other while trying to maintain proper behavior, their natural boyish energy barely contained by the new circumstances. Sarah helped serve the younger children with the competence of someone who had been shouldering adult responsibilities for too long. Jacob maintained his protective watchfulness, but Cole noticed that some of the tension had left his shoulders. And Elizabeth presided over it all with quiet authority, making sure everyone had enough to eat while keeping the conversation light and reassuring. "Mr. Cole," she said during a lull in the children's chatter, "tomorrow I'd like to discuss how My siblings and I can best contribute to the work of this ranch. We're not helpless, and we don't want to be a burden." Cole set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Miss Jenkins, I want to be very clear about something. Yes, the legal contract specifies that you and your siblings will provide labor in exchange for housing and support. But I won't have children working like adults or sacrificing their education for the sake of ranch chores." Jacob looked up sharply at the mention of education. "Will we be able to go to school?" "There's a schoolhouse about 5 miles down the road," Cole replied. "It's a small school with children from several ranches and farms. I see no reason why all of you shouldn't attend regularly, except perhaps for Benjamin, who might be too young for formal schooling just yet." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "That's very generous. In our hometown, the children missed considerable schooling while our parents were ill and after they died. They're all bright and eager to learn." The conversation continued in this vein throughout the meal, with Cole learning more about the Jenkins family's history and capabilities. Elizabeth had helped her mother with the younger children while also excelling in her own studies. Jacob had worked alongside his father on their small homestead and was knowledgeable about basic farming and animal husbandry. Sarah had a natural talent for organization and household management. Even the younger children had been shaped by necessity into helpful, responsible children who understood the value of contributing to family welfare. As the evening progressed and the younger children began to show signs of fatigue, Elizabeth organized the bedtime routines with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Cole found himself relegated to the role of observer, watching this family knit itself back together in the space of a few hours, finding comfort in familiar patterns despite their dramatically changed circumstances. But it wasn't until later, after the children had been settled in their beds and Elizabeth had insisted on helping Mrs. Winters with the supper dishes, that the real conversation began. They sat in the great room with cups of coffee, the lamplight creating a circle of warmth against the growing darkness outside. Cole had lit a small fire in the massive fireplace, more for comfort than warmth, and the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Mr. Cole," Elizabeth began, then paused and corrected herself. "Jackson, I need you to understand something about my family situation." Cole waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say required careful attention. "We're not charity cases," she continued, her voice firm despite its quiet tone. "My parents were good people who worked hard to provide for their family. Their deaths were a terrible tragedy, and our subsequent difficulties were due to circumstances beyond our control. But we're not weak people, and we're not looking for someone to take care of us indefinitely." Cole nodded slowly. "I didn't think you were. What I'm trying to say is that we need this arrangement to work for everyone involved. I won't have my brothers and sisters growing up feeling like servants or dependents. They need to maintain their dignity and their sense of their own worth." The words carried weight that went beyond their surface meaning. Cole realized that Elizabeth was negotiating the terms of their coexistence, establishing boundaries that would allow her family to accept help without losing their self-respect. "I understand," he said, "and I agree completely. Whatever arrangement we work out needs to feel fair and respectful to everyone involved." Elizabeth studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his words matched his intentions. Finally, she seemed to reach a conclusion that satisfied her. "In that case," she said, "I think we can make this work." Outside, the night wind whispered through the desert landscape surrounding the ranch house. Inside, two people who had been strangers that morning began the delicate process of building trust and defining the boundaries of an unconventional household. Cole looked at this young woman who had appeared in his life so unexpectedly and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond accumulating wealth and power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and complications, but tonight the ranch house felt alive with the sounds and energy of family life. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jackson Montgomery Cole looked forward to the coming of dawn. The first week at the Starlight Valley Ranch passed with remarkable transformation. Jackson Cole found himself rising each morning to the unfamiliar sounds of a bustling household. Children's voices calling to one another, Elizabeth's quiet instructions as she organized the day, and the general commotion of 7 young people beginning their routines. After years of waking to the efficient but impersonal sounds of his staff, preparing for the day, the change felt both disorienting and deeply satisfying. Elizabeth had proven herself an exceptional manager. Within days, she had established routines that kept the household running smoothly while ensuring that everyone, including Cole himself, had clearly defined roles that respected their abilities and preferences. The children responded to her gentle but firm guidance with immediate cooperation that spoke of deep trust and established patterns of family unity. Jacob had appointed himself Cole's shadow during morning ranch inspections, following him on horseback and asking thoughtful questions about cattle breeding, grazing rotation, and business management. The boy possessed a natural understanding of ranch operations that impressed Cole considerably. Despite his youth, Jacob approached each task with focused attention and keen intelligence. "How do you know when to move the herds to fresh grazing land?" Jacob asked on Thursday morning as they rode together along the eastern boundary of the property. Cole paused, appreciating the boy's genuine interest. "You watch for signs that the grass is being depleted in one area. See how the cattle are spread out there." He pointed to a distant herd. "When they start bunching closer together, competing for the remaining good grass, it's time to move them." Jacob absorbed this information with serious attention. "So you have to understand both the land and the animals." "Exactly. Ranching isn't just about owning cattle, it's about maintaining balance. The land feeds the cattle, and the cattle help maintain the land if managed properly." This exchange represented a pattern that developed throughout the week. Jacob's questions went far beyond simple curiosity. He was systematically learning everything he could about ranching, not just the how but the why behind Cole's decisions. Cole found the boy's intelligence both impressive and refreshing. Jacob thought like a natural steward rather than merely a businessman. Sarah, meanwhile, had become Mrs. Garcia's willing apprentice in managing the household. At 11 years old, she possessed organizational skills that surprised even the experienced housekeeper. She could keep track of which linens needed washing, which rooms needed attention, and how to properly care for the fine furnishings throughout the house. Cole often observed Sarah creating simple games that taught the twins how to make beds or dust shelves, transforming necessary chores into activities that engaged rather than burdened them. The twins, Hannah and Rebecca, had emerged from their initial shyness with remarkable speed. Their personalities, previously overshadowed by trauma and exhaustion, blossomed in the security of their new environment. Hannah proved to be naturally artistic, spending hours drawing with pencils and paper Cole provided. Rebecca showed an affinity for animals, often following Harrison to the stables to help with caring for the horses. David and Michael, the middle boys, had discovered the joys of open space and freedom after months of confinement in the overcrowded orphanage. Their natural energy found constructive outlets in exploring the ranch under Jacob's supervision, helping with age-appropriate chores, and engaging in the kind of play that growing boys needed for healthy development. Little Benjamin, at just 4 years old, became everyone's favorite. His natural curiosity and ready smile won over even the most stoic ranch hands, who would sneak him small treats or carve simple toys during their rest periods. Cole frequently found the child sitting on Harrison's lap during evening reports, solemnly holding the foreman's hat while the older man discussed ranch business. More importantly, Elizabeth had begun to relax the hypervigilance that had characterized her first days at the ranch. Her conversations with Cole revealed a sharp intelligence, gentle humor, and perspective on life that challenged his assumptions without ever seeming judgmental or intrusive. "You've built something remarkable here," she observed on Friday morning. As they walked together through the vegetable garden Mrs. Winters had established behind the kitchen. "This ranch employs dozens of men and supports their families. That's a significant contribution to the territory." Cole shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "I've been fortunate. The land is good, and I found the right people to help me." Elizabeth paused in her harvesting of fresh vegetables for the day's meals and looked at him directly. "Success and fortune are different things, Jackson. This ranch didn't build itself. You made choices and took risks that others wouldn't have." Her observation was accurate but diplomatically stated. During his 15 years in the territory, Cole had taken calculated gambles that his competitors considered foolish investing. In superior breeding stock, installing modern equipment, treating his workers well enough that they rarely left for other opportunities. The result was an operation twice as profitable as his nearest competitors. "I suppose I've always been driven to build something that would last," he admitted. "Something more meaningful than just accumulating wealth." Elizabeth's expression softened with understanding. "And now?" Cole considered the question seriously. Looking around the ranch, he could see evidence of renewed purpose everywhere. Jacob had designed an improved feeding system for the younger calves without being asked. Sarah had reorganized the household supplies with impressive efficiency. Even the twins had contributed by establishing a small flower garden near the front porch, bringing beauty to a place that had previously valued only function. "Now I'm beginning to understand that a legacy isn't just about what you build," he said. "It's about who you build it with and who you build it for." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats on the road leading to the ranch. Cole looked up to see a rider approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visitation. As the horseman drew closer, Cole recognized him as young Charlie Simmons, son of his carriage driver and occasional messenger for the town telegraph office. "Mr. Cole," Charlie called out as he reined in his horse near the garden fence. "I've got news from town that you ought to hear right away." Cole felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. In his experience, news that required immediate delivery rarely brought anything positive. "What's happened, Charlie?" The young man glanced uncertainly at Elizabeth, clearly unsure whether the information he carried should be shared in front of her. Cole noticed the hesitation and felt a flash of irritation. "Miss Jenkins is part of my household," he said firmly. "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of her." Charlie nodded and continued. "Well, sir, there's been considerable talk in town this week about your situation here. Some folks are saying it's not proper, a wealthy bachelor taking in a family of orphans, especially with a girl of Miss Jenkins's age." Cole felt heat rise in his face. "And what business is it of anyone in town how I choose to run my own household?" "That's just it, sir," Charlie replied. "Some people are making it their business. Judge Harmon has been asking questions about the county auction. Mr. Briggs, the rancher who is bidding against you, he's been telling anyone who'll listen that you outbid him for improper purposes." Elizabeth had gone very still beside Cole, her hands clenched around the handle of her garden basket. He could see tension radiating from her posture, and realized that she had probably expected this kind of reaction from the beginning. "There's more," Charlie continued reluctantly. "Sheriff Reynolds has been getting pressure to investigate the circumstances of the auction. Some people are claiming that the county didn't have proper authority to bind out orphans that way, and they're suggesting that the whole arrangement should be declared invalid." Cole felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The implications of Charlie's news were staggering. If the county auction was declared invalid, the Jenkins children could be forced back into the orphanage or, worse, separated and bound out individually to anyone willing to pay the county's fees. Who's leading this campaign? Cole asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mostly it's Walter Briggs and Judge Harmon, Charlie confirmed. But they've got support from some of the other prominent families in town. Mrs. Holloway has been organizing the church ladies to petition the territorial governor. They're planning to present their concerns at next Monday's county meeting. Cole looked at Elizabeth and saw his own fears reflected in her expression. She had been through this kind of community persecution before. He recognized the carefully controlled way she held herself, the quick assessment of potential threats in her eyes. These were the responses of someone who had learned to recognize danger before it fully materialized. "Thank you for the warning, Charlie," Cole said. "I appreciate you riding out here to let me know what's happening." After the young man left, Cole and Elizabeth stood in the garden in heavy silence. Around them, the evidence of their week's work, the orderly rows of vegetables, the repaired fences, the general air of prosperity and contentment, seemed suddenly fragile and threatened. "I should have expected this," Elizabeth said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "People don't like arrangements that challenge their assumptions about how families should look or how social boundaries should be maintained." Cole turned to face her fully. "Are you afraid?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm afraid for my brothers and sisters," she said. "I've seen what happens when communities decide that a family doesn't meet their standards of respectability. The consequences usually fall hardest on the most vulnerable." Her words carried the weight of experience, and Cole realized that the Jenkins family's current situation was probably not their first encounter with social disapproval and its potentially devastating effects. "Then we need to be prepared," he said. "We need to understand exactly what legal challenges we might face and how to respond to them." Over the next 2 days, Cole made several trips into Silverstone to gather information and assess the extent of the opposition they faced. What he discovered was more troubling than he had anticipated. Judge Harmon had indeed been holding private meetings with territorial officials, suggesting that the county orphanage had exceeded its authority in binding out all 7 Jenkins children to a single bachelor with no experience in child rearing. While he had been careful not to directly question Cole's motives, his implications were clear enough that everyone understood exactly which aspects of the arrangement he found concerning. Walter Briggs, meanwhile, had been more direct in his approach. He had visited several businesses in town, including the bank, the general store, and the saloon, openly suggesting that Cole's judgment had become unreliable and that extending credit or conducting business with him might prove unwise. Most concerning of all, Sheriff Reynolds had confirmed that he was under pressure to investigate the circumstances of the county auction. While he had stopped short of suggesting that any laws had been broken, he made it clear that continued community pressure might force him to take official action. "Jackson," the sheriff said during their private conversation in his office, "I've known you for 10 years, and I don't believe for a minute that you've done anything improper. But perception matters, especially in situations involving young women and children. You need to be prepared for the possibility that this arrangement might not be legally sustainable." Cole left the sheriff's office with a growing sense of urgency. The community's opposition was organized, vocal, and potentially powerful enough to disrupt the fragile stability that the Jenkins children had just begun to establish. When he returned to the ranch that evening, he found Elizabeth waiting for him on the front porch, her expression serious but composed. The children were nowhere in sight, suggesting that she had deliberately arranged for privacy during their conversation. "I can see from your face that the news isn't good," she said as he climbed the porch steps. Cole sat down in the wooden chair beside hers and explained everything he had learned during his visits to town. Elizabeth listened without interruption, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated she was absorbing every detail with careful attention. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes, staring out across the range where the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and copper. "Jackson," she said finally, I want you to know that if this becomes too difficult or dangerous for you, my siblings and I will find another solution. We won't allow your reputation or your business to be destroyed because of us." The offer was made with quiet dignity, but Cole could hear the pain underlying her words. She was preparing to sacrifice the security and happiness her family had found here in order to protect him from the consequences of his own moral choice. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "We're going to fight this together." Elizabeth turned to look at him directly, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and uncertainty. "And how do you propose we do that?" Cole had been thinking about exactly that question during his ride home from town. The solution he had in mind was unexpected and would require careful consideration, but it might be their only chance to secure the legal and social protection the Jenkins family needed. "We're going to give the community exactly what they say they want," he said. "We're going to make this arrangement completely respectable according to their own standards." Elizabeth's expression showed that she understood his meaning immediately, though whether she welcomed the implication remained unclear. "Marriage," she said quietly. "Marriage," Cole confirmed. "A legal, religious ceremony that would make you my wife and your siblings my adopted family. It would eliminate every legal challenge to our arrangement and remove most of the moral objections as well." The proposal hung in the air between them, fraught with complexity and implications that neither of them had fully considered when they began this conversation. Around them, the evening sounds of the ranch continued, horses nickering softly in their stalls, cattle lowing in the distance, the gentle creaking of the house settling against its foundation. Elizabeth was quiet for so long that Cole began to worry he had overstepped some crucial boundary. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of practical consideration and emotional uncertainty. "It would solve the immediate legal problems," she said slowly. "But marriage is supposed to be based on mutual respect and shared purpose, not just legal convenience. What kind of foundation would that be for a family?" Cole had been wrestling with the same question. His proposal was logical, practical, and probably necessary for their mutual protection. But it was also a profound leap from their current arrangement as household members to a legal and emotional partnership that would bind them together for life. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I respect you and care about your siblings more than I ever expected to care about anyone. And I know that losing their family now would be devastating for all of us." In the gathering darkness, Elizabeth reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his. It was the first deliberately intimate gesture either of them had made, and it carried weight far beyond its simple physical expression. "Let me think about it," she said. "This decision affects not just us, but 6 children who have already experienced too much disruption and uncertainty." Cole nodded, understanding that he had presented her with an impossible choice between potential disaster and an untested leap of faith. Whatever decision she made would shape the future of 8 people and determine whether their unconventional family could survive the storm that was gathering around them. As they sat together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, both knew that time was running out. Monday's county meeting was only 3 days away, and whatever action they decided to take would need to happen quickly. The battle for their family's survival was about to begin in earnest. Elizabeth Jenkins spent Saturday night walking the boundaries of the Starlight Valley ranch, her shawl pulled tight against the desert night chill as she wrestled with the most consequential decision of her life. The moon hung full and bright above the Arizona landscape, casting everything in silver light that made the familiar surroundings seem dreamlike and strange. She had sent her siblings to bed hours earlier after a supper marked by unusual quiet. From the adults and puzzled glances from Jacob, who possessed an uncomfortable ability to sense undercurrents of tension. Now, with the house settled into nighttime stillness, Elizabeth allowed herself the luxury of solitary contemplation. Jackson's proposal had shaken her more than she had let him see. Not because the idea was unwelcome. If she was honest with herself, she had begun to develop feelings for this thoughtful, principled man that went far beyond gratitude or practical appreciation, but because accepting his offer would mean crossing a threshold from which there could be no return, binding her fate and her siblings' futures to someone she had known for barely 2 weeks. The path Elizabeth followed took her past the newly constructed children's garden, where Hannah and Rebecca had spent hours planting wildflower seeds under Mrs. Garcia's supervision. The carefully marked rows represented more than just future blooms. They symbolized stability, planning for seasons ahead, the luxury of believing in tomorrow that had been absent from their lives since their parents' illness. In these quiet moments, walking alone beneath the vast desert sky, Elizabeth wrestled with a decision that would alter 7 lives forever. Marriage to Jackson Montgomery Cole would provide legal protection and social standing that could shield her siblings from being separated or returned to the orphanage. It would transform them from charity cases to legitimate family members of one of the territory's wealthiest men. Yet the personal implications for her were profound and complex. She had known Jackson for only 2 weeks, 14 days of observing his character, his treatment of her siblings, his interactions with his employees. Was that enough time to commit her life to him? Her parents had enjoyed a loving marriage built on years of courtship and shared values. They had faced hardships together, their bond strengthening through challenges rather than forming because of them. Would a marriage born from crisis ever transform into something genuine? As she walked, Elizabeth found herself thinking about her mother's advice during the months before her death. "Look for kindness in a man," she had said while teaching Elizabeth to make bread, their hands working side by side in the warm dough. "Not just kindness to you, but to those who can offer him nothing in return. That shows the true heart." By that measure, Jackson Cole had proven himself exceptional. She had watched him spend patient hours teaching Jacob about ranching operations when most men would have sent the boy away as a nuisance. She had seen him listen seriously to little Benjamin's disjointed stories, treating the 4-year-old's thoughts with the same respect he showed his foreman. She had observed his quiet insistence that his ranch hands treat all the Jenkins children with courtesy, setting a standard through example rather than commands. The moon cast her shadow long across the desert ground as Elizabeth reached the eastern boundary of the ranch's main compound. Before her stretched miles of grazing land, dotted with sleeping cattle barely visible in the moonlight. Behind her stood the impressive ranch house, a single lamp still burning in what she knew was Jackson's study. He was likely awake too, waiting for her decision while respecting her need for space to make it. What kind of man offered marriage to a penniless young woman burdened with 6 siblings? The cynical part of her mind, hardened by months of disappointment and loss, suggested various unsavory motives. But those explanations contradicted everything she had observed about Jackson Cole. He had shown no inappropriate interest in her personally. His attention to her siblings had been consistently appropriate and kind. His wealth meant he could have easily found a socially advantageous match with any number of eligible young women from prominent families. Yet he had offered to bind his life and fortune to a family with nothing to contribute but complications and potential scandal. As she completed her circuit of the ranch and approached the main house once more, Elizabeth found clarity emerging from her tumultuous thoughts. This decision couldn't be evaluated by traditional standards. Nothing about their situation was conventional. Perhaps their potential marriage shouldn't be judged by conventional expectations either. If she viewed marriage to Jackson not as a romantic ideal but as a partnership founded on mutual respect and shared purpose, the protection and nurturing of 6 vulnerable children, then her decision became clearer. She had seen enough of his character to trust him with her siblings' welfare. The rest, whatever personal relationship might develop between them, could evolve naturally over time, without the pressure of romantic expectations, Elizabeth found. Jackson where she expected, in his study reviewing ranch accounts despite the late hour. He looked up at her soft knock, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes revealed apprehension. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, but remained standing herself, needing the strength that came from physical composure. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. Jackson set down his pen and gave her his full attention, waiting for her to continue rather than pressing for an answer. "Before I tell you, I need to ask something." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "If we marry, what are your expectations? I mean for us personally." The question hung between them, laden with implications about intimacy, affection, and the fundamental nature of their relationship. Elizabeth could see Jackson struggling with how to respond honestly without presuming too much or promising too little. "I respect you deeply," he said finally. "Any arrangement between us would be based on that respect first and foremost. I would never expect anything you weren't freely willing to give." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "And my siblings would legally become your children?" "Yes, I would formally adopt all 6 of them, giving them my name and legal protection. They would be my heirs with all the rights and security that entails." The implications of that statement weren't lost on Elizabeth. Jackson Cole was making all 7 of them beneficiaries of his considerable fortune, a commitment that went far beyond temporary charity. "Then I accept your proposal," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. "Not for myself, but for them. They deserve security and opportunity after everything they've lost." Jackson rose from his chair and came around the desk, stopping a respectful distance from her. "Elizabeth, I want you to be certain. This isn't a decision you should make solely for their benefit." She looked up at him, struck by the genuine concern in his expression. "I'm making it for all of us, including you. You saved us from a terrible fate, and now we have the opportunity to build something meaningful together. I don't know what that will look like exactly, but I'm willing to discover it alongside you." The simple dignity in her words seemed to touch something deep in Jackson. He extended his hand to her, and when she placed hers in it, the gesture symbolized more than just agreement. It represented a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Then we should make arrangements immediately," he said. "Judge Preston is a friend of mine who lives in the next county. He could perform the ceremony tomorrow afternoon, which would give us legal standing before Monday's meeting." Elizabeth nodded, the practical reality of their decision settling over her. "I should speak with Jacob and Sarah first. They're old enough to understand what's happening, and they deserve to hear it from me before we proceed." Jackson agreed immediately. "Of course. This affects them directly, and their feelings matter." As Elizabeth turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Jackson, thank you for giving us the dignity of choice. Many men in your position would have simply decided our future without consultation." "That's not the kind of family I'm hoping to build," he replied simply. Those words followed Elizabeth as she returned to her room, resonating with unexpected promise. Perhaps this unconventional beginning might lead to something genuine after all. The next morning, Elizabeth found Jacob already awake, sitting on the porch steps watching the sun rise over the eastern range. She wasn't surprised. Her brother had developed an uncanny sensitivity to changes that might affect his siblings' welfare. "Jacob," she said softly, settling beside him on the steps, "I need to talk with you about something important." He turned to her, his young face serious in the early light. "It's about what those people in town are trying to do, isn't it? They want to send us back to the orphanage." Elizabeth wasn't shocked by his awareness. Jacob had always been perceptive, observing adult conversations and drawing accurate conclusions, even when they thought he wasn't paying attention. "Some people in town are questioning Mr. Cole's right to take us in," she confirmed. "There's a real possibility they could invalidate the arrangement and separate us." Jacob's jaw tightened with the anger that seemed far too adult for his 13 years. "They don't care about us. They just don't like that someone like him helped people like us." Elizabeth felt her heart ache at the bitter truth in her brother's assessment. "Mr. Cole has proposed a solution that would protect our family legally," she said carefully. "He's asked me to marry him, which would make all of you his adopted children." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, processing this unexpected development. "Do you love him?" he asked finally, the question cutting straight to the heart of adult complexities with childlike directness. "I respect him deeply," Elizabeth answered honestly. "He's shown genuine kindness to all of us, asking nothing in return. Love is complicated, especially when it begins this way, but I believe it can grow from respect and shared purpose." Jacob considered this, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. Would he be good to us? Would he treat us like real family instead of charity cases? Elizabeth thought about the past 2 weeks, Jackson's patience with Benjamin's endless questions, his genuine interest in Jacob's mechanical aptitude, his insistence that all the children continue their education despite the practical challenges of frontier schooling. "Yes," she said with complete confidence. "He already treats us like family, not obligations." Jacob nodded slowly, his natural protectiveness warring with practical necessity. "Then I think you should do it, for all of us." Elizabeth pulled her brother into a tight embrace, overwhelmed by the maturity of his response. "I'll still be your sister first," she whispered. "That will never change." "I know," Jacob replied, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "But maybe it would be nice to have a father again, too." Later that morning, after similar conversations with Sarah and carefully simplified explanations to the younger children, Elizabeth found Jackson in the stable preparing his best carriage for the journey to Judge Preston's ranch. He looked up as she approached, his expression questioning. "They understand," she said simply, "and they support our decision." The relief in Jackson's face was evident. "I've sent word to Judge Preston. He's expecting us this afternoon." He hesitated before adding, "I've also arranged for Mrs. Garcia to take the children into town tomorrow to purchase new clothing. Regardless of how Monday's meeting unfolds, I want them to have proper attire that reflects their position as members of this family." The thoughtfulness of this gesture acknowledging the children's dignity and status before any legal proceedings confirmed for Elizabeth that she had made the right decision. The wedding preparations were necessarily simple given the urgent timeline. Elizabeth wore her best dress, a modest blue cotton that Mrs. Garcia had helped her mend and press to perfection. Sarah had gathered wildflowers from around the ranch to create a small bouquet, while Mrs. Winters prepared a special dinner for their return. The children were beside themselves with excitement, viewing the day as an adventure rather than the serious legal proceeding it primarily represented. Judge Preston's ranch lay 20 miles south, a prosperous but less ostentatious operation than Starlight Valley. The judge himself was a dignified older man who had known Jackson for many years, having advised him on his first land purchases in the territory. His wife, a kind-faced woman named Margaret, welcomed the Jenkins children with genuine warmth, immediately enlisting the twins to help her set out refreshments while making Benjamin feel important by allowing him to carry a small tray of cookies. The ceremony itself was brief but conducted with appropriate solemnity. Judge Preston had arranged for his foreman and housekeeper to serve as witnesses, ensuring the legal validity of the proceedings. When Jackson placed a simple gold band on Elizabeth's finger, a ring he had purchased during one of his trips to town, she realized with surprise the moment carried more emotional weight than she had anticipated. "By the authority vested in me by the Arizona Territory," Judge Preston concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss, no romantic flourish that might have made the arrangement feel false or theatrical. Instead, Jackson took both her hands in his and spoke with quiet sincerity. "I will honor this commitment and protect this family with everything I possess," he said, his words clearly meant as a vow beyond the standard ceremony. "And I will stand beside you as we build something worthy of these children's futures." Elizabeth replied, finding the words rising naturally from her heart. The simple exchange felt more meaningful than any elaborate ritual could have been, a genuine promise between partners rather than romantic pretense. After a celebratory meal at the judge's ranch, they returned to Starlight Valley in the late afternoon. As the carriage crested the final hill overlooking the property, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of emotions. The imposing main house now represented something different, not just shelter for her siblings, but her marital home, the center of a new life she had never imagined for herself. Jackson seemed to sense her thoughts. "Everything will proceed at whatever pace feels right to you," he said quietly, while the children chattered excitedly in the rear seats of the carriage. "Nothing has to change between us except in legal terms." Elizabeth appreciated his sensitivity, but also recognized that everything had already changed in ways both subtle and profound. She was no longer Elizabeth Jenkins, orphan daughter of struggling homesteaders, but Elizabeth Cole, wife of one of the territory's most successful ranchers. Her siblings were no longer charity cases but legitimate heirs to a significant fortune. And the man beside her was no longer their benefactor, but their legal guardian and her husband. That evening, the Starlight Valley ranch house took on a festive atmosphere despite the serious circumstances that had prompted the marriage. Mrs. Winters prepared a special dinner featuring dishes she had learned the children particularly enjoyed. Mrs. Garcia had decorated the dining room with more wildflowers and arranged for small gifts. For each child, hair ribbons for the girls, pocket knives for the older boys, and a carved wooden horse for Benjamin that brought tears to the little boy's eyes. Throughout the evening, Elizabeth observed Jackson's interactions with the children, noting how naturally he responded to each one's unique personality. He discussed cattle breeding with Jacob, complimented Sarah on her organizational skills, admired Hannah's drawings and Rebecca's descriptions of the foals in the stable, listened to David and Michael's excited plans for exploring the western reaches of the ranch, and patiently answered Benjamin's endless why questions about everything, from stars to cattle brands. These weren't the actions of a man fulfilling a reluctant obligation. They reflected genuine interest and growing attachment. Whether he had expected it or not, Jackson Montgomery Cole was becoming something more than a benefactor to these children. He was becoming family. After the younger children had been put to bed, amid much excitement and speculation about the upcoming county meeting, Elizabeth found herself alone with Jackson in the study that had become his customary evening retreat. The weight of tomorrow's confrontation hung between them, tempering the day's celebratory mood. "Are you prepared for what we might face?" Jackson asked, pouring a small glass of brandy for himself and offering tea to Elizabeth. "I've faced community disapproval before," she replied, accepting the tea gratefully. "When my father lost his first homestead during the drought 5 years ago, many people blamed his poor management rather than circumstances beyond his control. We experienced firsthand how quickly neighbors can become judges." Jackson nodded, understanding reflected in his expression. "Tomorrow will be difficult. Briggs and his supporters won't accept our marriage as legitimate. They'll claim it's merely a legal maneuver to circumvent proper procedures." "Isn't that exactly what it is?" Elizabeth asked with unexpected candor. Jackson considered her question seriously. "Partially," he admitted. "But that doesn't make our commitment to these children any less genuine. Sometimes good intentions and legal necessities align." The honesty in his response confirmed Elizabeth's growing trust in his character. He could have offered empty reassurances or romantic platitudes. Instead, he acknowledged the complexity of their situation while reaffirming their shared purpose. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "we'll face it together, for the children's sake." "For all our sakes," Jackson corrected gently. "This family includes you and me now, not just the children." As Elizabeth prepared for bed in her own room and arrangement they had agreed would continue indefinitely, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. 2 weeks ago, she had stood on an auction block with her siblings, facing a future of potential separation and exploitation. Now she was the wife of Jackson Montgomery Cole, mistress of Starlight Valley Ranch with legal protection for her entire family. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges when they faced the county meeting. But for tonight, against all odds, Elizabeth allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: hope. Monday's county meeting had been a spectacle from the moment Jackson and Elizabeth Cole walked into the Silverstone town hall, their marriage certificate secured in Jackson's inside pocket. The modest building buzzed with tension as townspeople filed into the main meeting room, their faces reflecting emotions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Children rarely attended such proceedings, but all 6 Jenkins siblings, now legally Cole children, sat in a neat row behind their new parents, their Sunday best clothes making a visible statement about their changed status. County Commissioner Edward Thornton called the meeting to order with formal gravity, his gavel striking the wooden podium with sharp authority. Beside him sat his fellow commissioners George Miller and Frederick Wilson, their expressions carefully neutral as they surveyed the packed room. "We're here today," Thornton announced, "to address concerns raised by several respected citizens regarding recent events in our community. Mr. Walter Briggs has requested the opportunity to present a formal complaint." Jackson felt Elizabeth's hand tighten in his as Briggs rose from his seat in the front row. The rancher had dressed for the occasion in an uncharacteristically clean suit, his thinning hair slicked down with macassar oil, his bearing radiating self-righteous confidence. "Honorable Commissioners," Briggs began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room, "I come before you today not as an individual seeking personal satisfaction, but as a concerned citizen protecting the moral foundation of our growing territory." He paused dramatically, scanning the crowd before continuing. 2 weeks ago, we witnessed an unprecedented violation of public trust when Jackson Cole purchased 7 orphan children at county auction, then proceeded to establish an improper household that has scandalized every decent family in Silverstone County. Jackson started to rise in protest, but Elizabeth's firm grip on his arm held him in place. Her eyes warned him to let Briggs finish his presentation before responding, a strategy that proved wise as the man's accusations grew increasingly outrageous. "This arrangement," Briggs continued, "was clearly established for purposes that don't bear mentioning in mixed company. Cole, a man evidently overcome by inappropriate interest in the eldest girl, saw an opportunity to acquire her and her siblings for his personal gratification under the guise of Christian charity." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the town hall. Several women in the gallery fanned themselves with obvious distress, while their husbands nodded grimly at Briggs's characterization of events. "Furthermore," Briggs pressed on, "the hasty marriage ceremony performed yesterday afternoon was clearly designed to legitimize this improper arrangement after the fact. It represents a mockery of the sacred institution of marriage and an insult to every respectable family in our community." Reverend Douglas rose from his seat to add his voice to the condemnation. "Brothers and sisters, I have witnessed the corruption that follows when moral standards are abandoned in favor of convenience and self-interest. This situation threatens the very fabric of Christian civilization in our territory." The Reverend's words carried particular weight with many in the audience, his religious authority lending credibility to accusations that might otherwise seem excessive. Jackson watched several faces in the crowd harden with conviction, their initial curiosity transforming into active hostility. Commissioner Miller leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Briggs, are you suggesting that the county auction itself was conducted improperly?" "I am indeed," Briggs replied with satisfaction. "The Jenkins orphans were bound out as a unit without proper investigation of alternative arrangements. No attempt was made to contact relatives who might have provided appropriate care. The entire proceeding was rushed and irregular. This accusation struck at the heart of Jackson and Elizabeth's legal protection. If the auction was deemed invalid, their marriage would provide little defense against charges of impropriety or child endangerment. Commissioner Wilson shuffled through papers on the table before him. "I have the auction records here. Everything appears to have been conducted according to established procedures." "Procedures that were manipulated," Briggs shot back, "to benefit a man whose judgment had clearly been compromised by unseemly desires." The attack was building momentum, and Jackson realized that their opponents had planned this assault carefully. Each accusation built upon the previous one, creating a narrative of corruption and impropriety that would be difficult to refute with simple denials. When Briggs finally yielded the floor, Commissioner Thornton looked directly at Jackson. "Mr. Cole, you have the right to respond to these accusations." Jackson rose slowly, acutely aware that every person in the packed room was studying his face for signs of guilt or deception. Beside him, Elizabeth sat with perfect composure, her presence lending strength to his resolve. "Honorable Commissioners," Jackson began, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "Everything you've heard today represents deliberate distortion of events that were motivated by human decency and Christian charity." He pulled the marriage certificate from his vest and held it up for all to see. "Mrs. Elizabeth Cole and I were legally married yesterday afternoon by Judge Preston, a respected jurist known to many of you. Our union was entered into freely by two adults who have developed genuine respect for each other, with the primary purpose of providing these orphan children with a stable, legitimate family. After 2 weeks of improper cohabitation..." Briggs interrupted from the audience. Jackson turned to face his accuser directly. "Mrs. Jenkins and her siblings occupied separate quarters in my house with proper supervision and complete propriety. Your accusations of misconduct exist only in your own corrupted imagination." The exchange sparked heated arguments throughout the town hall as supporters of both sides voiced their opinions loudly. Commissioner Thornton's gavel struck repeatedly as he called for order. Furthermore, Jackson continued when quiet was restored, "I challenge anyone in this room to point to a single instance of actual misconduct or impropriety. You'll find none, because none occurred. What you will find is 7 orphan children who were facing separation and exploitation, being offered sanctuary by someone with the means to help." Reverend Douglas rose again, his voice carrying the righteous authority of the pulpit. "Mr. Cole, the appearance of impropriety is itself a violation of Christian standards. An unmarried man living with children and a young woman creates scandal regardless of what actually occurred behind closed doors. Then you should be satisfied." Elizabeth's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. "Because we are no longer unmarried." Her decision to speak surprised everyone, including Jackson. Women rarely addressed public meetings, and Elizabeth's intervention drew shocked stares from throughout the hall. But her words carried compelling logic. "Gentlemen," she continued with quiet dignity, "if the concern was propriety, then our marriage has addressed that concern. If the issue was the welfare of my siblings, then their adoption into a stable, loving household has resolved that as well. What exactly is the continuing problem?" Briggs's face flushed with anger at being challenged by a woman, especially one he considered beneath his station. "The problem, madam, is that your hasty marriage cannot erase the scandal of your previous conduct." "What previous conduct?" Elizabeth asked with devastating calm. "I was an orphaned girl trying to care for my brothers and sisters after my parents' tragic deaths. Mr. Cole offered us shelter and protection when we had nowhere else to turn. He treated us with respect and kindness. The question is not why he helped us, but why you and others are so determined to prevent it." The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental weakness in their opponent's position. No one could point to specific acts of impropriety because none had occurred. The entire case rested on assumptions and prejudices rather than evidence. Commissioner Wilson seemed to recognize this problem. "Mr. Briggs, do you have any witnesses to actual misconduct? Any evidence beyond speculation and moral concern?" Briggs's confidence wavered slightly. "The evidence is the situation itself. A respectable rancher doesn't take in strange children unless his motives are improper." "According to whom?" Jackson demanded. "According to what law or moral principle?" "I'm not aware of any regulation that prohibits Christian charity or requires men to ignore children in distress." The debate continued for another hour, with various community members rising to voice their opinions on both sides of the issue. Jackson was surprised to discover that their situation had supporters as well as detractors. Several ranch owners spoke about the obvious improvement in the children's health and demeanor. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the general store near the stage depot, provided particularly effective testimony. "I've seen those children in town several times over the past 2 weeks," she declared. "They're polite, well-dressed, and obviously well cared for. Whatever Mr. and Mrs. Cole are doing, it's working to their benefit." But the most devastating moment came when Dr. Samuel Turner, the county's most respected physician, rose to address the commissioners. "Gentlemen, I was called to examine Joseph and Mary Jenkins during their final illness. I can testify that they were good people who loved their children deeply. Their dying concern was about what would happen to their family after their deaths." The doctor paused, looking directly at Jackson and Elizabeth. "If Joseph and Mary Jenkins could see their children now healthy, secure, and clearly thriving, I believe they would consider the Coles a blessing rather than a threat." This testimony seemed to shift the mood in the room significantly. Several people who had been nodding along with Briggs's accusations now looked uncertain about their position. The commissioners conferred quietly among themselves before Commissioner Thornton addressed the room again. "Having heard all testimony and examined the relevant documents, we find no grounds for invalidating either the county auction or the subsequent marriage and adoption. The Jenkins children, now legally Cole children, will remain in the custody of Jackson and Elizabeth Cole in accordance with territorial law." A wave of reaction swept through the hall, relief from some, anger from others, and murmurs of continued debate from many. But the legal question had been resolved, at least for the moment. As the meeting adjourned and people began to file out, Jackson found himself surrounded by a curious mixture of supporters and detractors, all eager to express their opinions about the proceedings. "Mr. Cole," called Mrs. Henderson from the general store, "my husband and I think you did exactly the right thing. Those children needed help, and you provided it." But her voice was nearly drowned out by angrier comments from Briggs's supporters. "It's an abomination," shouted someone Jackson didn't recognize. "Decent people won't stand for this kind of corruption." Jackson gathered his new family close, protecting them from the worst of the hostile comments as they made their way to their waiting carriage. Though they had won the legal battle, it was clear that a significant portion of the community remained unconvinced of their legitimacy as a family. As they drove away from town, the children unusually quiet after witnessing the contentious proceedings, Elizabeth leaned close to Jackson and spoke softly so only he could hear. "This isn't over, is it?" Jackson shook his head slightly. "I'm afraid not. We've won legally, but we've made enemies who won't accept defeat gracefully." His prediction proved accurate sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Jackson discovered that someone had cut sections of his boundary fencing during the night, allowing nearly 50 head of prime breeding cattle to scatter into the surrounding countryside. The message was unmistakable. If legal methods couldn't drive the Cole family away, other approaches would be employed. Standing in the damaged pasture, directing ranch hands in the effort to recover the missing cattle, Jackson realized that their real battle was just beginning. The county meeting had been merely a prelude to the sustained campaign of harassment and intimidation that would now follow. As he rode back to the main house to tell Elizabeth about the latest attack on their livelihood, Jackson saw her waiting. On the front porch, her face reflecting the same determined resolve he felt building in his own chest. They would not be driven away. But the cost of staying was about to become much higher than either of them had anticipated. "They've started, haven't they?" Elizabeth asked as he dismounted. Jackson nodded grimly. "Fence cutting. We've lost track of about 50 head of cattle. The children need to know what we're facing," she said after a moment of consideration. "Jacob and Sarah are old enough to understand, and even the younger ones need to be prepared." "You're right," Jackson agreed. "No secrets between us. That's the only way we'll survive this." That evening, gathered around the dinner table, Jackson and Elizabeth explained the situation to the children in age-appropriate terms. Jacob listened with intense concentration, occasionally asking questions that revealed his growing understanding of the adult world's complexities. "So they don't really care about us at all," he concluded with bitter clarity. "They just don't like that someone rich and important is treating poor orphans like family. Some people have very fixed ideas about how society should work," Jackson explained carefully. "When someone challenges those ideas, even by doing something good, it makes them uncomfortable." "But that's stupid," David interjected with the straightforward logic of a 9-year-old. "It may seem that way," Elizabeth said, "but these beliefs run very deep. People build their entire understanding of the world around certain rules and boundaries. When those are questioned, they feel threatened." "Are we in danger?" Sarah asked, her voice small but steady, her arm automatically going around little Benjamin's shoulders. Jackson and Elizabeth exchanged a look, silently agreeing on honesty. "There might be more trouble," Jackson admitted. "But I promise you this, I will protect this family with everything I have. No one will harm any of you while I draw breath." The simple declaration, delivered without drama or exaggeration, seemed to reassure the children more than elaborate promises might have. "Done." They recognized the authentic determination in his voice, the unwavering commitment to their welfare that had been demonstrated consistently since the day he first brought them home. "What can we do to help?" Jacob asked, straightening his shoulders. With newfound purpose. "Stay together," Elizabeth answered promptly. "Watch out for each other. And remember that no matter what anyone says about us, we know the truth about our family." "We're Coles now," Hannah said with unexpected firmness from her place at the table. "All of us." The simple statement from the normally quiet 6-year-old touched something deep in Jackson's heart. Despite the legal complexities and social disapproval, despite the hasty circumstances of their union, these children had accepted him as family with the unquestioning faith that only the young can offer. And that moment, surrounded by these 7 individuals who had entered his life so unexpectedly, Jackson Montgomery Cole made a silent vow more binding than any legal document or public ceremony. He would not merely protect them from external threats, he would build something that transformed their forced alliance into a genuine family, something that would outlast the current crisis and provide lasting meaning for all their lives. The attacks escalated over the following weeks. Water sources on the outer ranges were contaminated. Rumors circulated in town questioning the quality of Cole beef, threatening his contracts with army forts and stage stations. Anonymous letters appeared in the territorial newspaper suggesting improprieties at Starlight Valley Ranch that went far beyond the initial accusations. Each attack was met with steady resistance. Jackson hired additional hands to patrol the property boundaries. Elizabeth made strategic appearances in town with the children, their obvious well-being contradicting the malicious rumors. Judge Preston published a formal statement in the newspaper confirming the legality and propriety of both the marriage ceremony and the adoption proceedings. But the most effective defense came from an unexpected quarter. The children themselves became the most powerful advocates for their new family's legitimacy. Jacob's mechanical aptitude flourished under Jackson's mentorship, resulting in an improved irrigation system that drew attention from neighboring ranchers. Sarah's natural organizational skills transformed the annual Territorial Fair Committee, which Elizabeth had joined at Mrs. Henderson's invitation. Even the younger children contributed, their evident happiness and improved circumstances providing living refutation of the accusations against the Coles. 6 weeks after the county meeting, as summer gave way to early autumn, the balance began to shift. Ranchers who had initially supported Briggs began to distance themselves from his increasingly extreme tactics. Business owners who had been reluctant to serve the Coles discovered that principle cost them customers who admired the family's resilience. The territorial governor, passing through on official business, accepted Jackson's dinner invitation and publicly praised the family's charitable example. The tide was turning, not through dramatic confrontation, but through this steady demonstration of integrity and family unity that gradually transformed public perception. The Cole family was writing a new definition of what family could mean in the harsh realities of frontier life, one based on choice and commitment rather than mere blood relation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.